the idea will be to quantify how the entry of a new micromobility innovation in a particular city impacts pre-existing sharing economy platforms such as ride-sharing and bike-sharing, as well as more broadly looking at their impact on consumer safety in a city. And this is important because prior literature, at least in marketing and management fields, have mostly focused on economic outcomes. So what happens when e-scooters enter a city on economic spending, particularly related to food and restaurant-related spending. So we're trying to go beyond those types of outcomes to understand the broader implications of these new micromobility innovations. Okay, let's start with, and again, I'm going to focus on Chicago, which is going to be my context, but let's start with a pop quiz. So how many years do you think it took ride-sharing services to reach their first 100 million rides? How many of you think it's A? One person. B? Okay. C? Okay, most of you I think are already experts in this domain. Last time I presented this work at Carnegie Mellon at Tepper, and I kind of accidentally gave away the answer by hitting next too soon. But the trick question is, how many years do you think it took e-scooters, which is a new micromobility innovation, to reach the same amount of rides? So you already know it's going to be shorter. That's my hint. How many of you think it's A? Okay, this audience, I don't even know. It is A, absolutely right. So why am I showing you this? Because the idea is e-scooters have expanded much more rapidly than other pre-existing innovations in the mobility space. And you might think, well, this is an unfair comparison. E-scooters are a much smaller market. If you look at their valuation, why should we even care? This is some small innovation happening in some few cities out there. But that's not true. Because A, within the micromobility segment, they're one of the biggest innovations. 64% of the rides are right now e-scooters. And even more so, at least in the US, they've already spread to 156 cities that are experimenting with them in some form or another. And more importantly, they're growing much faster, including compared to bike sharing. So if you look at these data from, this is a snapshot from US cities. If you look at bike sharing, which is in blue and yellow, e-scooters in orange have spread out much more to a lot more cities. But most of these are pilot programs. So cities have not actually made them a permanent feature yet because they're uncertain about how they will impact a variety of outcomes for their consumers, but also for firms and generally for the environment. And if you notice Chicago, which is going to be the pilot that this paper is going to study, in 2019, e-scooters were allowed to enter. 10 different companies could launch their e-scooters in select areas of Chicago, and that's the quasi-experimental variation we're going to study in this project. What I do want to emphasize here is the difference between these is going to be the last mile reach, because with e-scooters and rideshare, you can reach your last point. If you're trying to go to a restaurant, you can stop right at that restaurant, whereas with the bike share, most of the time, at least the way they work in the US, they're docked systems. So you need to drop off the bike at a station. So rather than thinking so much about the physical effort, also appreciating the fact that with bikes, it's almost like public transportation. You have to drop it off at a particular place. It can't give you access to the end last mile that you're trying to get to. So hopefully that helps you appreciate some of the differences. Again, we're going to focus only on shared systems. So throughout this talk, do not think about people's ownership of bikes and scooters as a way of transporting. And the main reason for that is we want to make a contribution to the sharing economy world, where these are still contentious and cities as well as companies are still figuring out how they would impact consumers. So we're only going to stay in the sharing economy world. The other piece here that might become important later is that when you talk about bike and e-scooters, typically it's one single rider carrying very few things, and you don't have a lot of storage space. And this becomes important when we look at how people use these different modes to transport and how they make their decisions. So if you think about a grocery trip, you probably are going to take rideshare rather than go on an e-scooter and buy groceries. Okay, so I want to give you a screenshot of how my hometown Delhi has looked in the last couple months, which is a lot of pollution, a lot of congestion, and which is one of the reasons why cities are experimenting with these forms of micromobility, because they want emission problems, as well as solve high traffic, high congestion. And this project is going to show you counterintuitive effects that actually e-scooters don't help solve the problem. And I will summarize very quickly what I've said so far. E-scooters are growing rapidly. Most cities launched them in order to solve these congestion, emission, equity problems, to create access to mobility. However, what we also notice is they can have these kind of downsides in terms of consumer safety. Lots of cities have reported accidents related to e-scooters, and it's not super clear what the overall takeaway should be for stakeholders that are deciding whether and when to launch these new interventions. And recent papers in marketing, in fact, to my knowledge, there's only 2 papers that have focused on restaurant-related spending, and they show that once e-scooters are launched, people actually tend to go to restaurants more, and they spend a lot more on dining and eating out. However, they are not really capturing beyond these economic effects what is the overall implication of e-scooters. Okay, so this paper, in a nutshell, is going to look at this introduction of a new innovation in micromobility. How does that affect incumbent mobility? Which pre-existing options that consumers can take are either ride-sharing or bike-sharing. Of course, we don't observe data on walking, which I really wish we did, because some of these e-scooter trips could also be replacing walking. And the second thing is, how does it affect consumer safety in terms of incidents of crimes, crashes, and so on? Importantly, is e-scooter doing what the cities are intending it to do in terms of improving access and equity, which we'll show you it's not. So more low-income and people of color are benefiting less from these services. And importantly, the mechanism is going to be related to how people use e-scooters. The trip purpose and intent, for instance, if you're thinking about using e-scooters as a way to complement your ride-sharing trip, perhaps going out to drink, and then not wanting to drive an e-scooter back, it might lead to more ride-sharing usage. So you use e-scooters for one part of the trip and not to return. Or you could even substitute bike sharing depending on if it's a longer trip versus a short trip, because you probably have more manual effort if it's a very long bike trip.
Would you get also data on public transportation, or like subway or buses? Or?
So we have some data on public transportation. I don't know, I'm showing you the results here, but they're in the paper. The main takeaway from the public transportation is going to be that when e-scooters are launched, people actually start using taxi services more, but not so much for buses and trains. So again, overall, it's not actually helping that much. Yes?
When you mention crashes, it's scooter crashes, car crashes, or both?
I will get to that.
Okay.
I do have a preview of results slide. I'm going to quickly summarize the contribution without going into too much detail. The idea of the contribution really is that most studies in the mobility literature have looked at economic outcomes, not beyond those. And in the sharing economy literature, we've mostly seen either Airbnb or Uber-related projects, and very few papers have actually looked at cross-platform effects. So we're going to capture how one kind of sharing economy platform can influence others. So that's a nutshell. Preview of results, because I know there's going to be questions. So before I just want to let you know where I'm going with this. So overall, I'm going to show you that once e-scooters are launched, over a period of 40 weeks in 2019, we see that ride-sharing usage actually goes up by 5%. So there is complementarity there. But people are substituting away from bike sharing by 14% because those trips actually go down. So counterintuitively, we find that actually the environmental costs of introducing e-scooters makes it actually worse with higher carbon emissions by 510 metric tons. We also find that crimes and crashes go up. And here I'll address your question briefly, which is that crashes are mostly those that involve small mobility vehicles, so e-scooters and bikes. We don't see any changes in highway collisions or motor vehicle accidents. And finally, with crimes, we again see crimes related to street and vehicle break-ins increasing, but not so much for gun violence or homicide and stuff like that.
How usually in the US and in Chicago particularly, how are the e-scooters usually used? Are people circulating in the streets or in the sidewalks?
So they're not supposed to be ridden on the sidewalks, but most people will. So pedestrians' experience of walking on sidewalks is actually more disruptive rather than the driving. And there are no e-scooter lanes. And then again, the effects are not equitable. Last finding here is going to be looking at the mechanism, which the review team again has urged us to look more at why is there complementarity with ride sharing. And one of the reasons we find is the relative features of bikes, e-scooters, and ride sharing help explain their effects, because only during non-peak traffic hours, when ride sharing is not actually, when ride sharing is actually useful, you actually see this kind of complementarity. You don't see complementarities when ride sharing would actually end up making people stay longer in traffic. And similarly for trip purposes where people want to carry more goods, so for instance shopping and grocery trips, or for evening restaurant trips, we see more of complementarity where there is increase in ride sharing.